Good to be with you this morning. Again, I'm Stuart Hicks and grew up in the real estate industry with many of you. And I want to start with a couple of questions. How many of you remember having or knowing someone who had a cell phone in their car, a mobile phone right there beside the car that you had to look down and dial? After that, how many of you remember the brick that you could carry around in a pouch or your briefcase? Wanted to bring one of those today, but we had a hard time finding one. Frank, who spent a career at Verizon, told me that he still has a few mementos from the big brick. Well, of course, many of us today have something that's about this size. And as was mentioned earlier, how many of you have been in an occupy space in an office building or visit clients in an office building where you get drop calls, you can't get a good line, you can't text or stream? How many of you had the experience getting the connectivity? Well, that's really what we're here about today. Many of us in the room talk a lot about the experience of our coworkers in office buildings, and that's really the discussion for today. So thank you for having us. We have two grizzled veterans here. Frank spent a career with the evolution of Verizon as it is today, and in most recent years as part of Verizon Wireless. Mark has been an entrepreneur in the space, started a number of companies that have evolved to one that he's involved with today called Airwavz. And we're here to talk about what is our experience, what's today, what's the future of wireless. But as you can see here, there's been an evolution that's occurred. And so with the experience of these two gentlemen, I'd first like to start with just talking about, let's get a grounding about where we are today and how cell service has evolved to get us where we are today. Let's start with Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, cellular has its roots back into the really mid-1940s with, was it mobile radio telephone, where you'd actually have a car phone, you'd have to pick it up and actually get an operator to help you place a call. That morphed into the mid-80s. I guess it was mobile telephone service, and then in the 60s we had improved mobile telephone services, and then in the 80s this technology came out, which was advanced mobile radio telephone services, or AMPS, which was really the genesis of cellular today. The wait lines, or the waiting list back in the I guess pre-cellular, you could wait up to 3 years just to get a phone to participate. But once cellular hit, it was really coupled with microprocessors that were able to do a lot of things to really challenge the boundaries of physics, if you will. But you can see from the slide, we quickly went from car phones to bag phones, if anybody remembers the bag phones, schlepping those around airports and whatnot, to flip phones back in the, I guess that would have been in the late 90s, we started to see some of the flip phones. Then I think it was in January of 2007, Steve Jobs came up on stage and introduced this thing called the smartphone, which really just fundamentally changed how we communicate today. That obviously morphed into, from what was voice, and networks being designed for voice communications, mostly on interstates and highways, to now people consuming videos and large amounts of data in office buildings. So it's just fascinating to see how fast we've grown really over the last 30 plus years in this industry. A lot ahead of us too. I think we've just...
So Frank, we're going to talk a lot about in-building wireless and what that means, but as that comes, will we still be building the big cell towers and the small cells that are on the street lamp post out there?
Yes, we definitely will, probably at a lower pace that has been happening over the last few years, right? Generally, you build towers to make sure that you do have coverage. As usage has increased, the surface that specific tower covers had to be cut into half, so therefore more towers were being built. I think that'll be much more targeted, but we will be building towers moving forward. On the small cell side, we're basically doing the same thing with the towers. but dividing this space and the number of users under a small cell to a significantly lower number than what a tower can handle. And the reason for doing that is because we don't have infinite spectrum. We have a limited amount of spectrum we have to use, and we have to divide it and divide it and divide it to create capacity. The demand for data over the last decade, 2 decades have been really, really dramatic.
Follow-up to that, Frank, as we evolve into in-building wireless, we're often beginning to hear the fourth and the fifth utility. What does that mean?
Really, the way that it can be viewed is when we think of developing a property, building a large building like the Bank of America building, we think of we need electricity, we need gas, we need water, and then the developer installs the required components inside the building. What cannot be expected is that the Duke Energy deploys all the wiring and all the copper inside the building. Same thing is happening into the wireless industry. As we move forward into needing and requiring tenants requiring excellent telecommunication services, wireless companies cannot afford to deploy wireless systems inside all of the buildings in the U.S. The price tag for that is tremendous. So it has to be divided onto the developers and property owners. You can think of it as another amenity, right? Such as having electricity or gas or water telecom services, which can be provided through Wi-Fi, through licensed spectrum and licensed technologies. But in general, that's the concept.
So water, gas, electricity, cell services, a fourth utility.
Telecommunications, that's correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Well, what about Wi-Fi? Can't Wi-Fi just take care of the needs that we have inside as an occupant inside an office building?
So not entirely. The issue with Wi-Fi is that it's a licensed spectrum, and it is not designed as well as a cellular system might be designed inside a building. And there is lots of interference, right? Too many transmission points interfering with each other. Limited spectrum, quality is low. Can it do a reasonable job? Yes, it can, and there will be a space for Wi-Fi without a doubt. But excellent telecommunications need to be through cellular services, whether it might be 4G, 5G, and moving forward.
Okay. Well, Mark, so you've been in this space a long time, and we're starting to hear about this in-building wireless, IBW. Just what does that infrastructure look like? Why is it important to the occupant experience today?
Yeah, I guess, just to look back at my comments prior, the user characteristics have really changed over the last decade with the evolution or the invention of the smartphone. Again, it was all about voice, highways, street, but now folks are really consuming a lot of communication services inside buildings. The buildings really don't have the infrastructure that the network on the street has today. So enterprise is also starting to adopt at a much faster rate wireless mobility services as part of mission critical applications. So they're starting to pull mobile services into their day-to-day operations. So we have this gap between what you call the client, I call the enterprise, building applications within their business, to really improve services for their customers. But the gap or the lack of infrastructure inside the building to really provide or really to make these applications work like they need to. So really looking at the infrastructure itself, I guess to level set a little bit, there's been some movement in building wireless infrastructure over the last decade. A lot of that was really what we call repeaters, where you would put an antenna on the roof and point it to a cell tower and basically pull that capacity from a cell tower and retransmit it through a building. Those days are kind of gone, again, because we're facing some real challenges in terms of adding capacity to the networks. So essentially today, what we're doing in in-building wireless infrastructure is we're essentially putting dedicated cell tower, for lack of a better term, inside the building where you have dedicated capacity, you have dedicated performance, and you're not really competing with the services on the street or serving areas outside of that. And to Frank's point, with Wi-Fi and cellular services or LTE, the LTE is going to provide a much higher performance to the enterprise or to the client than Wi-Fi. Again, Wi-Fi sits in an unlicensed, it's unpredictable. You have no way to really guarantee the performance of a Wi-Fi network. And there's some security challenges. But as you move into the cellular and to the LTE side of it, it is licensed, it is controllable. The cellular carriers, I think, have spent well over $100 billion just for spectrum to deploy over the last few decades. So it's going to provide a much more secure environment. It's going to provide the capacity that you need. I know a lot of people think of coverage, but really behind the scenes, you got to have the capacity and the tonnage to deliver that data. But it provides the that mission criticality that I think enterprise are going to need kind of going forward to support the applications that they need to run their business. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those applications, I believe, through the show.
So last month I listened to a webinar that the big office building developer Vornado held. And the chief technology leader there for Vornado said that over the last decade, two of the big carriers, at least two, AT&T and Verizon, have installed some kind of in-building capacity in many of their office buildings. Is that going to continue? Is that going to change? Why?
So, as I mentioned before, the price tag for doing in-building systems is high, and when you multiply times Q, P times Q, it just becomes unsustainable. So, are wireless carriers going to deploy some in-building systems? Yes, like they have been doing up to now. But it's going to be a very limited amount of them. It's going to be a Grand Central Station where there's lots of public going through it. There's going to be a NFL stadium. It's going to be key buildings like that. As Mark was pointing out, it boils down to signal coming from the outside world to serve the building. So there are many buildings out there that have ample signal. But think of it this way. It's like a radio station. You got a radio and you go from channel to channel. You get 3 channels, right? So that's the capacity that serves the building today. But when you have the demand to have 6 channels and you're only receiving 3 channels, you have to create more channels inside the building. And as data demand continues to grow, that is basically what is going to be happening. So you might have enough signal inside, but you might not have the bandwidth that a specific application might demand.
I want to add to that as well, that what you see in a building today in terms of coverage and the capacity piece being that wheel spinning as you're trying to open an app, that is not static. As consumption in the network as a whole continues to grow, and I believe we're tracking 30-40% demand growth on these networks every year, and that's been consistent for decades. I mean, it hasn't fluctuated a whole lot. Basically, we're having to double capacity on the networks every 2 to 3 years, which is just, sometimes hard to get your head around. But the point I want to underscore here is what you have in your building today, both in terms of coverage and the tonnage or the capacity, is not static, and that will deteriorate or degrade over time as consumption per device continues to go up. So what you have in buildings or what you see in buildings today is probably the best you're going to see, unless you have an in-building system, is probably the best you're going to see going forward. It will slowly degrade over time, so I'm sorry.
Okay. So for those of us in the audience who our companies own office buildings or we're big tenants in those office buildings, we need to be concerned about the infrastructure inside the building and the ability to meet this growing demand, competition for cell space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does need to be looked at as, the fourth utility piece, and the analogy we use is, it's a building owner's responsibility to hire the plumber. It's the water company's responsibility to bring the water to the meter. Same thing with electricity. It's the building owner's responsibility to hire the electrician, and Duke Energy or the power company will bring power to the meter. And that's how we see this market evolving. As Frank said, there's just not enough capital to go around to do what needs to be done. So we look to the building owner to help put the infrastructure in, and we look to Verizon and the other carriers to bring the radio source or the service, to that infrastructure. So very, very similar across all utilities, and we're trying to look at it the same way.
Okay. So let's look to the future. Everybody's heard about 5G. What does 5G mean? What's it going to do for us? What's Verizon's role in this evolution?
So 5G is the next generation of wireless, which is going to be transformational. While up to now, except the specific instances that were transformational, like Mark pointed out and Steve Jobs in 2007, this is very transformational, and the reason for it is because it has two very distinct attributes that make it so. Number one is latency. It's very low latency. Things happen very, very quickly in 5G, in the 5G world. Number two is bandwidth. Bandwidth is dependent on the spectrum used. But for instance, Verizon Wireless is deploying millimeter wave for 5G outdoors. That will now be the application for indoors. But think of smart cities, think of driverless cars with many cameras, radar, LiDAR, and all kinds of different data going back and forth from that car to ensure that it stays safely and that it crosses the intersection on time, right? So many of the issues with traffic today will be resolved that way. If you translate that to factories, the same thing will happen. Think of a very large factory with many robots manufacturing specific things. Think of GM. They're building a pickup truck on that factory, and the demand needs that factory change to a sedan, to manufacturing a sedan. It's a matter of downloading all of this software very quickly to ensure that all of the steps are made and that factory changes into manufacturing a different version of the car. We'll translate that to many different industries and obviously in building systems, automating the in-building systems, virtual meeting rooms, holograms to be able to talk to others, virtual reality. There are many different applications that will be driven by an enabler, which is 5G. And that's why I say that it's truly transformational, because it's gonna really change the way we do things.
How long is it gonna take for 5G to roll out?
So carriers are very aggressively rolling out 5G. It's very incipient, and we should see some significant changes over the next 2 to 3 years. 2019 is going to be very important. There's going to be a lot of noise about it. Something to remember is that you can deploy 5G with one radio channel that is fairly narrow, and therefore the bandwidth will be the bandwidth that you get, the amount of data you can transfer is smaller, or you can deploy with a much wider channel. The millimeter wave option to be done outdoors is very wide channels, lots of data being moved very, very quickly, and very low latency. As we move into in-building, millimeter wave might not be as applicable. Mid-band or even low band as existing today will be applicable. It's a matter of aggregating the different bands to be able to provide enough throughput. As we move forward over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, usage on 4G will start declining and 5G will start picking up. Much like it's happened, and you can see the graph there earlier, on 1G, 2G, 3G, and 4G, right? Most of the data that the 3G networks 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago were carrying a lot of the data on the wireless carriers is being now transferred to 4G. Therefore, the spectrum goes to 4G and the spectrum will go to 5G as well.
So geographically, where is that going to happen on one coast or the other, or big cities versus small cities, or where should we turn our attention?
So initially will be where the most usage is, right, which is the core of the cities and the bigger cities, and eventually will evolve into the entire footprint. What will happen is that where the demand is where millimeter wave and more carrier spectrum aggregation will be done, and as you move forward to the more rural areas, you still will have 5G, you still will have the latency provided by 5G and many other attributes, spectral efficiency, being able to slice the network for different applications, but a different type of a spectrum might be used out there, right? Low band and or mid band versus millimeter wave in the core of the cities. And as I pointed out before, you know, in building is very likely not to be millimeter wave unless there is a very large atrium, right? And then the propagation, the millimeter wave is done there. But as you go into corridors and different rooms, it will be more a mid wave and low band, mid band and low band.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, just specific 5G to you know, in-building commercial real estate as a whole. I think what 5G is going to offer, you know, specifically this audience right here. I think we'll see it first evolve into the industrial space where, you know, that latency or that time when you request data and the time you get that data back, that latency piece is super, super short. When you got robotics and you know, different manufacturing processes where that's super critical. I think that's where we'll start to see it evolve initially. And then into, as Frank alluded to, smart cities. I like to look at really into the smart building. And I think we'll see what 5G really offers today. You know, everybody has a cell phone, have a laptop, they connect. When we get into 5G and this Internet of Things, which I'm sure you've seen up here a few times, we've got to connect thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of devices to this network, which we don't do today. These are going to be sensors and cameras and you know, different telemetry components within the building that managers, you know, air quality, energy, people in, people out, different things like that, security, you know, whatever it is, probably yet to be developed or even invented yet. But that's where we're going to really see 5G emerge in the commercial real estate, and I think energy conservation is probably the first piece of that in the smart building, because there's a direct correlation to cost or cost savings. With energy, it's a big nut to crack. But that's where, you know, 5G I think is really going to impact the commercial real estate community, is really getting these buildings smart, if you will.
So you mentioned cost, and this audience thinks a lot about cost because we have to. I read recently that JP Morgan eliminated the desktop phone in an entire line of business. How many of you in the room are in businesses that have begun to think about that or even done something?
Price Waterhouse did too.
Price Waterhouse did it. So tell us, let's talk a little bit about that. Are there significant savings? Is bring your own device to work driving that opportunity for us in the room? Sure, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to draw on history because I think it really kind of portrays, you know, where we're going. I mean, how many people have landline phones today?
In their home?
In their home.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the enterprise is definitely heading that direction without a doubt. I go back to the enterprise really starting to build business applications around mobility and just the increase in productivity, enhancements to, you know, their customers. I think we're going to really see enterprise start to build programs around mobility. You know, whether it be displacing the you know, the landline phone, which is critical, and then that spurs on a whole bunch of other, you know, challenges as far as public safety and E911 and things of that sort, which we understand. We're well aware of that. But yeah, it's inevitable. It's just a matter of time until that desk phone is off the.
You know,
off the desk.
Mark made a really good point. In residential areas, we have dropped the landline, right? In residential areas, when there is poor in-building coverage, the consumer basically that's equivalent to the fourth utility. They get a network standard that gets connected and it connects through the internet and it provides ample signal for them to be able to make calls and have enough data. But you know, the industry is going in that direction. I believe that just came out or is going to come out fairly recently here to where you can have 2 SIM cards into the same phone. So you can have your private telephone line and then your work telephone line on the same device, which is going in that direction, right?
So if I'm a corporate real estate executive and I'm trying to save money, I'm really interested in, can I eliminate hardline phones from the desks of our offices? I'm not about to do that until the building I'm in, I'm confident, can accommodate that cell phone. Is it a meaningful amount of money? Anybody in the audience have experience where you can quantify, are there significant savings from eliminating that desktop? Anybody have experience? Well, we saw a bunch of experience, but nobody can quantify it. I don't know. But there is a wave happening, so I presume it's.
I would argue, I don't know the numbers, but I would argue the cost of replacing a PBX or whatever they call them today, soft switches, I guess they call them today, to support desk phones is probably more expensive than putting the in-building wireless infrastructure in and just moving to a mobile device. We probably need to peel that onion back, but I bet it's a pretty equal.
Okay, interesting
cost.
analysis for us to take home and think about. Whether you're a corporate real estate executive or a broker or a project manager, how many of you are seeing the question asked of a building landlord what the capacity, the coverage strength in their building is? Are your brokers asking that question for you? Yes? No? Yes?
And we do see that on a regular basis, actually.
Yeah, and I think that is twofold, right? The first one is there any coverage? Is there any service? Can I make phone calls, right? And then it goes into the next one, which is, okay, what bandwidth do I get and what can I do with it? What kind of applications? What kind of automation? What kind of other applications there are for a larger bandwidth in that building?
So I want to stop for the moment and just ask if there are questions on your mind that you'd like to ask this panel. Yes?
Yeah, you were talking about Wi-Fi earlier and how reliability is going to go down compared to cellular. A while back I heard about Wi-Fi, light fidelity, like where data is transferred over light, and how that's secure because light doesn't go through walls, and how it's like 100,000 times faster. So maybe think about the capacity issues you're talking about building up to. If they can take away the Wi-Fi and use Wi-Fi, will that allow you more capacity? Or is that even a real thing?
And just for the audience outside this room, the question is Li-Fi versus Wi-Fi, and is Li-Fi
Li
or light?
Okay.
Yeah, using light instead of RF frequencies to move data. To be honest with you, pretty embedded in the industry right now. I don't see any roadmaps of that. I see a lot of challenges in and around Li-Fi. I'm somewhat familiar with it, and the issue is propagation, getting it through walls, getting it through furniture, getting it around corners. So we have some of the same challenges with some of this new higher frequency spectrum that the FCC is actually auctioning right now. What are they up to? About $800 million, I think was the latest number. But the higher frequencies don't go through walls and don't go around corners. So, you know, you create these voids or these pockets where you don't have coverage. So you got to balance that, you know, with ubiquitous and reliability in the coverage. So we try to look at, you know, projects holistically. Could it happen? Yeah. There's technologies, in and around beamforming antennas and different things, but there's still a little ways out. We're trying to keep a good grip on the industry. I would say 3 to 5 years out. It is super dynamic. It's changing very fast. And again, when you're growing at 40% a year, basically doubling infrastructure every 2 or 3 years, things change very, very quickly. Potentially at some point in the future, it could be there, but I think what we have ahead of us we have some new spectrum. At the end of the day, it's all about radio waves, hence the name Airwavz. It's really all about spectrum, and we look at our company really as a proxy to spectrum. Wi-Fi, the challenges there is spectrum. There's an auction going on right now for 5G spectrum. Frank mentioned low band, high band spectrum. There's just this whole grouping of radio waves out there that we're trying to work with to deliver a quality product. Light is considered in that as well, but like I said, I don't see an immediate roadmap there. Down the road, absolutely.
Another question?
We have a lot of wiring systems in buildings. Everybody talks about the Ethernet and the data, and those are kind of combined into voice over IP. But we've got energy wiring, and we've got security wiring, and we've got fire panel wiring, and I'm sure I'm leaving something out. But we have a lot of independent systems. There's been some companies that have tried to combine them, but I'm not sure anybody has done it. What I'm hearing is that 5G could potentially get rid of all that.
It will get rid of all that. Absolutely.
So
Yep.
what you'll do is you'll replace the wiring systems that we're currently investing in with wireless systems.
Absolutely. Whether it be a desk phone, your broadband Ethernet connection, or the many networks that connect security systems, elevator, HVAC, lighting systems, all of that fits into that bucket of Internet of Things, and that's really what 5G is going to change. We put that system in, and again, I just look at the cost of wiring a building. We can put 5G type services in cheaper than you can wire a building, a lot cheaper.
Steve, is there an expense to that? To maintain?
To the wiring?
Yeah, for sure.
It's expensive. I mean,
Absolutely.
put all that in. I don't know what the expense of the antennas are, but it seems like you're now talking about trading off, just building your buildings in a different way.
Well, I don't know what the price for cabling is, but we're less than 1 cent a square foot a month for wireless infrastructure. And that's.
So just to pile on, so the question, if you didn't hear it in the back, was there's a lot of wiring for different purposes, telecommunications wiring in a building. Can that be consolidated or will it go away with 5G? And the answer was a resounding yes. My question would be, to get ready for 5G, does a building owner or a major tenant in the building, do you need to have in-building wireless capability to be able to function with 5G?
Yeah, I really see 5G as really a journey and not a destination. We're already starting to see some of the, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of 5G is really built on the LTE platform. I know that there's new standards being evolved, but carrier aggregation, combining all those disparate spectrum groups into one so it produces more than each one would do individually, I think is a step towards 5G. So I think we'll start to see some of the benefits sooner rather than later of 5G, and I think we can start to incorporate some of those IoT things even today, even before we get true 5G into the buildings, which.
As new generations of radios come for 4G that will be upgradable to 5G via software, definitely the fiber optics that needs to be deployed to connect all of the antennas, because they are active antennas, they're massive MIMO is what is referred to, which is basically up to 100 antennas and to 100 small transmitters and receivers and antennas into a little square. In the case of millimeter wave, in the case of mid-band is a little bit larger, and so therefore is scaled down the number of antennas that can be done. But that all of that is applicable and will be useful when buildings evolving to the 5G side. A lot of the infrastructure that is being deployed, right, to support 4G today.
Okay. One more question back here.
Yes, as 5G drives connection to machines and end-user devices away from wired and wireless, can you talk to the cybersecurity risks of those? Because it changes a little bit, right? I would think.
Yeah, so, you know, generally the newer protocols in wireless, such as, I mean, you know, when we were back to 1G, it was all, you could listen on a scanner, right, or even television. But as protocols have evolved, such as 4G and 5G, they're much more secure. But think of it, you know, building PVCs, private virtual networks, inside that BIM of large data. You're slicing that portion, and then you put in your cybersecurity protocol on top of that to be able to even be more protected, right? You know, I haven't heard much about hackers breaking into 4G LTE, right? Because it's so protected. It's basically spreading many bits and bytes through a very wide spectrum, and some of them could be in one section and some of them in another section. So they're fairly well protected. Nonetheless, there is always that building on top of it.
But so much of what's now 4G is really more in the convenience environment, the residential environment, those connections. But as it moves into high security manufacturing operations, banking systems, people like that are now starting to depend on those connections being wireless instead of wired. I'm just interested in how that community is going to view this whole thing, and whether that will be a headwind to the 5G.
So much of it is being used today. The government and law enforcement agencies, banks, as alternative to the landline on ATM machines, and even remote offices and whatnot. So, I mean, a lot of that is already being done today. The question is, how much more can you do, and how can it improve your efficiency, right? And again, it comes down to bandwidth, and it comes down to latency. So, I mean, it goes back to the same thing. I mean, ultimately, different applications will build additional security over an already secure link on the wireless side.
I think we're being given the nod.
I'm asking if you would please repeat
The questions, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we have a minute or two more. Any other questions? Yes, over here. He hung.
Yeah, so I spent a few years somewhat in this space trying to sell it. Most of it was educating and trying to find who owns the decision to buy. So that's my question for this. From in commercial real estate, is it the developer? Is it the property management company? Is it the money behind the developer? But then in a corporate real estate scenario where it's anchor tenant or build-to-suit, who in the corporation owns the decision? Is it IT? Is it engineering? Is it property management? Is it, in some cases, the carrier who will invest in the infrastructure with the payback of the traffic on their network? And in general, where do you find the decision to be made to make this type of investment?
So the question is, who owns the decision? The owner of the building, the tenant in the building, the carrier, Verizon, some of their supply chain? Where's the decision lie? Mark?
So I'm sorry, let me just speak about the carrier, right? The carrier is going to be very selective on where they deploy it and where they invest, because it's very pricey, and the carriers cannot afford to do every other building out there. So in the cases the carriers does it, it's not as much as they're going to increase revenue for more data going through the system. because the revenue per megabyte continue to decline, and everyone is expecting that it will continue to decline as we move forward into 5G, because the volumes of data that you will be moving will be so high. It is a matter of a building against Grand Central Station that moves millions and millions of people that are not tied to any given a corporation through a very public venue. That might be funded by a carrier. Bank of America building or something that is private corporations, we need to move away from that because we cannot afford to do it. Now, do you want to comment on the other part of the?
So Hunter, I've seen there are about 5 million office buildings in the United States, small, medium, and large. And one of our slides up here showed that it would take over $1 trillion of capital to put in-building wireless in even the larger of those. So that's why Verizon and AT&T, they just don't have the balance sheets to be able to do that. So then maybe they'll continue to do selective sites, but then the building owner has tenants they want to keep happy, or they want to lure new tenants to their building. Now maybe the corporate occupant owns some of its own buildings, so in that case they're the building owner, so maybe they make the decision, or maybe as a big tenant, you insist that your building owner do something about it, because he's trying to keep you happy. So I think there are multiple answers, and it depends on the occasion, almost case by case.
I just want to really quick add to it. There's really 3, maybe 4 discrete models in this environment. One is a carrier funds the whole thing. They put the infrastructure, they work with the asset manager to put that in. The other is that the venue makes the investment and puts it in to serve tenants or attract and retain tenants. And the third is a third party, such as us, where we make the investment, we own the infrastructure, we operate it, and work with both the carrier and the building owner. And the fourth one that's emerging a little bit, and I think will gain some momentum here over the next few years, is I think the enterprise itself is going to start taking more control of their LTE networks in the enterprise space, because I'm sensing just in my travels, the corporate tenant. I'm sorry, I come from a different world. But I'm sensing that they may not wait for either the carriers or the building owners to make these investments, and they need to get this infrastructure in place, to forward their business cause, if you will. So. There's a whole bunch. We typically today work directly with the asset managers because these are long-term leases. We do look at it as infrastructure. As Frank said, it's very fiber rich. We put a lot of fiber in the building to support not only what we're doing today, but we've got good visibility as to where things were going. But I hope that answered your question.
And then ultimately, I would view it as the following, right? When you build a business campus, you invest on a gym or some other amenities, a pool or whatever the tenant demands, right? And for that, you charge 1 cent more per square foot or whatever it might be. This is very similar. It's another amenity. That's the way it needs to be viewed, I think.
I think we've reached the end of our session. Thank you very much. I think the takeaway would be go back to your teams that are planning, work with your service providers, try to understand your base case today and what you need to do to prepare for the future.